It's beautiful up here.
Not as beautiful as you.
I love you.
I love you too.
You won't get away with this!
No!
Help! She fell! Call an ambulance! Oh my God! Somebody help!
Some men throw away gold and spend the rest of their lives picking up brass, wondering why nothing shines. Emmanuel Osei threw away Elizabeth Adeyemi on a Tuesday, an ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday, and told himself he was making room for better things. He had no idea that better things had already found her first, and that her new last name would one day make grown men in 3 countries lower their voices. If you've ever watched someone underestimate the wrong person and pay everything for it, this story is for you. Hit that like button, subscribe, and don't you dare look away. Because what's coming for Emmanuel, not even his ancestors saw it coming. There is a specific kind of woman the world tends to underestimate. She is not the loudest in the room. She does not announce her intelligence or perform her worth for audiences who haven't earned it. She laughs genuinely, loves thoroughly, and carries herself with the particular calm of someone who has done serious business with pain and come out the other side still standing, still soft, still hers. Elizabeth Adeyemi was exactly that kind of woman, and Emmanuel Osei, God help him, had spent 3 years completely failing to notice. They had met at a rooftop gathering in Lagos on a warm Friday evening when the sky looked like it had been painted by someone who'd just fallen in love for the first time. A mutual friend's birthday, good music, better jollof, and Emmanuel, standing near the railing in a cream agbada, quoting Chinua Achebe to a small, captivated circle as though he had personally known the man. Elizabeth had not been captivated. She had been mildly interested, which, for a woman who once read 3 structural engineering textbooks on a flight to Abuja without once looking out the window, was practically fireworks. He was magnetic. She would always give him that. Emmanuel Osei could enter a room and rearrange it simply by deciding where to stand. He was handsome in that precise, sculpted way, the kind of face that made people momentarily forget what they were saying mid-sentence. His laughter arrived in full, generous waves. His opinions were delivered like gifts you didn't know you needed. He was, in the vocabulary of women who have loved the wrong person, everything on the surface. Elizabeth, a structural engineer, should have understood better than most that a beautiful exterior means nothing if the foundation is hollow. She learned it anyway, the hard way, the way most women learn it, slowly, quietly, one small sacrifice at a time, until the pile is so high you can no longer see over it to remember who you were before you started stacking. For 3 years, she was his calendar filler and his emotional landfill. She attended his work events as a friend. She held his hand through business crises that were, without exception, self-inflicted. She cooked for him on Sundays, argued his corner in rooms he wasn't in, and rearranged her own schedule, her deadlines, her consultations, her sleep, around the particular chaos of loving a man who had never once asked himself whether he deserved her. He didn't know she was pregnant when he ended it. But that detail, as Elizabeth's mother would later say, was God's own timing. It happened on a Tuesday in a cafe on Victoria Island. The kind of cafe that plays jazz at a volume just loud enough to feel sophisticated and just low enough to hear everything being said at the next table. Emmanuel was wearing a gray shirt. He had ordered an Americano he didn't touch. And he had looked across the table at Elizabeth, this woman who had traveled 4 hours in Lagos traffic just 3 weeks earlier to sit beside him while he panicked over a contract and told her he needed space to grow. Elizabeth had looked at him for a long moment, space to grow, as though she had been a ceiling. As though 3 years of showing up completely, consistently, and quietly had somehow compressed him rather than expanded him. As though the problem with their relationship was that she had loved him too well and left him no room to become whatever story he was telling himself now. She said nothing. She picked up her handbag. She left the exact change for her coffee, not his, just hers, and she walked out. No tears, no raised voice, no dramatic last words. The only thing Emmanuel would remember about that moment, later, when everything had already collapsed, was that she had left without asking him to reconsider. Most women asked. They pushed back, cried, bargained. Elizabeth had simply gathered herself and left, like someone who had just decided a building wasn't structurally sound and had no interest in standing inside it when the ceiling finally came down. He told himself, over the next several days, that her calm was proof she hadn't really cared. He was wrong, of course. Her calm was proof of something else entirely. 3 weeks later, Elizabeth sat in a clinic in Yaba, staring at a small paper result with the expression of a woman doing rapid mental architecture, pregnant. 6 weeks. The math was simple and the implications were enormous. She called her mother. Her mother said 2 things, God is not asleep, and buy a warm coat. Then her mother booked her a one-way flight to Seoul. Now, Before you decide what you think about Emmanuel, before you write him off entirely as a man who didn't deserve her, ask yourself something. Have you ever watched someone leave your life with more dignity than you gave them, and felt, for just one strange moment, like you were the one being left behind? Because Emmanuel felt it. Standing on his balcony that night, Americano finally in hand, looking at Lagos spread out below him like a city that didn't particularly care about anyone's feelings, he felt it. He just didn't understand it yet. Hit that like button if you believe what's done in the dark always comes back to the light. And subscribe, because the kind of people who throw away women like Elizabeth, they never see what's coming until it's already arrived. Seoul was waiting. And so was Jun Gi-choi. Seoul does not care about your heartbreak. That is, arguably, its greatest gift. The city moves with the particular indifference of something ancient and electric simultaneously. Neon signs bleeding color onto wet pavement at midnight, subway trains arriving with mechanical punctuality, entire neighborhoods humming with the business of people who have places to be, and absolutely no interest in your personal devastation. Elizabeth arrived in early November with one large suitcase, a pregnancy she hadn't yet told anyone except her mother, and the particular hollowness of a woman who had recently discovered that 3 years of her life had been load-bearing walls in someone else's house. Her college roommate, Adaez, met her at Incheon Airport, holding a handwritten sign that read Elizabeth Adeyemi, survivor in large, cheerful letters, which made Elizabeth laugh for the first time in 3 weeks and cry immediately afterward, which is the specific emotional sequence of someone who desperately needed both. Adaez had lived in Seoul for 6 years. She had the apartment, the language, the local restaurant loyalties, and the specific authority of a woman who had mastered a city that initially had no reason to welcome her. She was also, crucially, the kind of friend who understood that sometimes what a person needs is not advice, but proximity. She did not interrogate Elizabeth on the drive from the airport. She simply turned up the heat, handed her a warm sweet potato from a paper bag, and drove. The apartment in Mapogu was clean, small, and quiet. 3 things Elizabeth needed more than she could articulate. It had a window that faced west, which meant the Han River sunsets arrived every evening like a scheduled appointment with something larger than herself. She kept every one of them. She would stand at that window with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea she barely tasted and watch the sky do its slow, indifferent work. Orange becoming pink, becoming that specific shade of purple that has no practical name, and she would feel, not better exactly, but located. Like someone who had been lost and had finally found, if not the destination, at least the road. The first month was survival. She cried with the disciplined frequency of someone who had allocated grief a specific time slot and refused to let it bleed into the rest of the schedule. Mornings were hard. The space between waking and full consciousness, that brief, merciful moment before memory returns, was the only peace she got, and it lasted approximately 4 seconds before everything came back. The cafe, the gray shirt, space to grow. She ate, she slept. She let Adaez drag her to a Jim Jilbang on a Thursday evening where they lay on heated floors in matching cotton shorts and said nothing of any importance for 2 hours, which was exactly what the doctor would have ordered had the doctor known. She also, quietly, began to fall in love with being pregnant. It surprised her. She had expected to feel burdened, complicated, caught. Instead, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, purposeful. There was a person arriving. A small, determined, entirely innocent person who had chosen, if you believed in such things, and Elizabeth's mother certainly did, to arrive precisely now, in this city, in this chapter, at this particular intersection of ending and beginning. The baby moved for the first time on a cold Wednesday morning in December, a faint flutter like a question mark pressed from the inside, and Elizabeth sat completely still and understood that whatever came next, she was not, in fact, alone. By the 2nd month, she had enrolled in a Korean language course at a community center 3 subway stops away. Her classmates were a retired Japanese architect, 2 American graduate students who were clearly dating and pretending not to be, and a Congolese woman named Bernadette who had lived in Seoul for 11 years and corrected the instructor twice in the first session without apology. Elizabeth liked her immediately. The freelance consulting work came through an international construction firm that had found her portfolio online and needed someone who understood load distribution in aging infrastructure. She worked from the apartment. She built spreadsheets and reviewed site reports and wrote structural assessments in the focused, methodical way she'd always worked, completely, precisely, without performance. The firm extended her contract after 6 weeks, then again after 8. Seoul was not healing her. She was healing herself. Seoul was simply decent enough to stay out of the way. She stopped reaching for her phone to call Emmanuel somewhere in the middle of her 3rd month. Not dramatically. Not as a decision, she announced to herself. She simply reached for it one morning out of habit, felt the familiar pull, and then set it back down and made tea instead. The pull didn't return. And then came the dinner in Itaewon. A mutual acquaintance, a French architect named Olivier, who had done work across 3 continents and collected interesting people the way others collected stamps, was hosting a private gathering. Small, curated. The kind of evening where the wine arrived without labels and the conversation arrived without pretense. Adaes had pushed her to go. You need to be around people who think, not just people who feel, she had said, which was such a precise diagnosis that Elizabeth had put on her good dress without further argument. She had not expected much. She had certainly not expected the man at the far end of the table. Still, quiet, wearing a dark suit with the kind of fit that suggested it had been made specifically for him and was not interested in discussing it, who watched her laugh at something Olivier said and did not look away. She noticed him noticing. She looked back once. He didn't pretend he hadn't been watching. That, Elizabeth would later tell Adaes, was the first thing she found interesting about Jungi Choi. He didn't perform innocence. There is a particular kind of dangerous that has nothing to do with volume. It does not announce itself. It does not pace or posture or fill rooms with noise to remind people it exists. It simply is, the way gravity simply is, the way deep water simply is, present, patient, and entirely unbothered by whether or not you have noticed it yet. Jungi Choi was that kind of dangerous. And Elizabeth Adeyemi, structural engineer, a woman professionally trained to identify what holds things up and what brings them down, recognized the load-bearing quality of him before she knew his name. The dinner at Olivier's apartment in Itaewon lasted 4 hours. It was the kind of evening that moves like a good river, unhurried, directional, occasionally deep. The guests were architects, a retired diplomat, a Korean film producer who spoke 6 languages and used all of them before dessert, and Bernadette from Elizabeth's language class, who had apparently known Olivier for years and arrived with a bottle of Burgundy and the energy of someone who had never once been intimidated by a room. Junji said very little for the first 2 hours. This was not shyness. Elizabeth understood the difference. Shy people fill silence apologetically, rushing to occupy the space before someone else can notice they've gone quiet. Junji occupied silence the way a building occupies land, deliberately, completely, without explanation. When he did speak, the table adjusted. Not dramatically. The way a room adjusts when the temperature changes. You don't notice the moment it happens, only that something is different now. He spoke about infrastructure. Someone had raised the subject of Seoul's rapid vertical expansion and the engineering compromises buried inside it. Most of the table offered opinions shaped by aesthetics. Junji offered one shaped by consequence. Beautiful buildings have buried cities before, he said. The ones that last were never built for the skyline, they were built for the ground. Elizabeth, who had spent 10 years thinking professionally about exactly this, looked at him across the table with the expression of someone who has just heard their own private thesis stated aloud by a stranger. He was already looking at her. Of course he was. After dinner, when the gathering softened into smaller conversations and someone put on music that didn't demand attention, Olivier made the introduction with the particular satisfaction of a man who knows he is doing something that will matter. Junji, this is Elizabeth Adeyemi, structural engineer, Lagos, now Seoul. Elizabeth, this is Jungi Choi. I heard what you said about the Mapo Bridge restoration, Jungi said before Olivier could finish. Your assessment was correct. The southern pylon has a stress fracture the official report chose not to prioritize. Elizabeth blinked. That report isn't public. No, he agreed simply. It isn't. Olivier excused himself with the speed of someone who understood he was no longer necessary. They talked for 40 minutes. Not about feelings or histories or the soft geography of personal revelation. They talked about buildings, about the tension between what structures are designed to hold and what they are actually asked to carry. About the arrogance of architects who design for beauty and leave the engineers to quietly solve for survival. It was genuinely the best conversation Elizabeth had in months. Jungi listened the way very few people listen, not waiting for a pause to insert himself, but actually receiving what she said, turning it over, responding to the specific thing she'd meant rather than the general thing she'd said. It was disarming. It was, if she was being precise, slightly unfair. At the end of the evening, he asked for her number. He didn't dress it up. No elaborate framing, no compliment engineered to create obligation. He simply said, I'd like to continue this conversation, and looked at her with the directness of someone who has never found dishonesty particularly efficient. She gave it to him. On the walk home, Adiez beside her, breath misting in the December cold, her friend said nothing for an entire block, which was a personal record. Then, Who was the quiet man? An acquaintance of Olivier's. He watched you the entire evening. I know. And you're smiling. Elizabeth was, in fact, smiling. She reached up and touched the corner of her mouth as though confirming a structural report. She said, which communicated nothing and everything simultaneously, and Adaes, who had known her for 15 years, understood completely. Junji texted the following morning, not at an hour designed to seem casual. At 8:47 a.m., which is the hour of a man who woke up, had coffee, thought about something, and decided to act on it without theater. The Incheon Bridge. Are you working on it or admiring it? Elizabeth stared at her phone. How do you know about the Incheon project? I recommended you for it. She sat with that for a moment. Not with suspicion, she had enough engineering instinct to know the difference between a man who maneuvers to control and a man who simply moves with intention. This was the latter. He had heard something that interested him. He had acted on it. He had not mentioned it until now because he apparently didn't need credit for doing what seemed to him like an obvious thing. You could have said something at dinner, she typed. You were already impressive before I told you, he replied. It seemed unnecessary. Adaes, reading over her shoulder, made a sound that was not quite a word. The Incheon consultation became a weekly site visit. Junji joined her twice, not to supervise, not to perform interest, but because he had genuine structural knowledge that surprised her every time it surfaced and a capacity for silence on site that she found, against all expectation, deeply companionable. He stood beside her on the bridge deck one gray January morning, both of them looking at the southern pylon, wind coming off the water with reckless enthusiasm, and he said nothing for a long time. Then, you build things that last. She turned to look at him. It's not a compliment, he clarified. It's an observation. The way you assess a structure, you're not looking at what it is, you're looking at what it's carrying. Elizabeth looked back at the bridge. Most people can't tell the difference, she said quietly. Most people, Jungi agreed, are not looking. He was looking. He had always been looking. And somewhere between the Incheon wind and the January gray, Elizabeth Adeyemi, who had sworn sincerely that she was done with all of this, felt something in her chest shift. Not dramatically. The way foundations shift in a thaw. Slow, deep, and entirely structural. She told Adaes that evening, sitting on the floor of the Mapogu apartment with takeout containers between them and the Han River doing its quiet work outside the window. I think I'm in trouble, Elizabeth said. Adaes picked up her chopsticks without looking up. Describe the trouble. He listens like it costs him something. Adaes put her chopsticks down, looked at Elizabeth with the full gravity of a woman who has been waiting 15 years to hear this exact sentence. Trouble, she confirmed. Absolutely. Back in Lagos, Emmanuel Osei was having a very good week. He had closed a new distribution contract, bought a second car he didn't need, and told the story of his breakup with Elizabeth to a friend over drinks, framing it, as men like Emmanuel always do, as a mutual and reasonable conclusion. We wanted different things. I needed room to evolve. His friend had nodded. Neither of them thought about Elizabeth for the rest of the evening, which was fine. Elizabeth wasn't thinking about them either. There is a moment in every love story that doesn't announce itself as the moment. It doesn't arrive with music or weather or the kind of cinematic lighting that tells you to pay attention. It arrives quietly, sideways, disguised as an ordinary Tuesday. And isn't it something that the most important things in Elizabeth Adeyemi's life kept arriving on Tuesdays, dressed in the ordinary clothing of a conversation, a silence, a hand extended at exactly the right angle. The moment for Elizabeth and Junji arrived in February. She was 7 months pregnant, moving through the world with the particular authority of a woman whose body has stopped asking permission for space and started simply occupying it. She had made peace with the fullness of herself. The weight, the slowness, the way strangers on the subway now offered seats with a gentleness that Seoul's reputation for urban indifference had not prepared her for. She had also made peace, largely, with the fact that the father of her child did not know he was one, had not called once since Victoria Island, and existed now in the part of her memory reserved for structural failures, studied, understood, filed, and no longer load-bearing. Junji had not pushed for information about her pregnancy. This was, Elizabeth understood, a deliberate and careful choice. He had acknowledged it early, simply without weight, the way he acknowledged most things. You don't have to explain anything to me, not now. Not unless you want to. And then he had continued being exactly who he was, which was a man who showed up, paid attention, and asked for nothing she hadn't offered. It was frankly disorienting. She had spent 3 years with a man who required constant emotional maintenance, feeding, reassurance, the daily performance of being interested in his interests, and had come to understand love as a thing that depleted. Junji was operating on an entirely different architecture. Being around him did not drain her. It did the opposite. She left his company feeling like a building that had just had its foundations quietly reinforced while she wasn't watching. The February moment arrived on a Sunday evening at his apartment in Yongsan-gu. He had cooked. Not to impress, she'd learned that about him early, that he did not perform domesticity for an audience but practiced it with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. Doenjang jjigae, rice, a side of japchae, because he had noticed 3 weeks earlier that she'd ordered it twice at the same restaurant and said nothing but eaten it with evident sincerity. He had remembered. Of course he had. They were sitting at his kitchen table after dinner, tea between them, the city doing its glittering, indifferent work outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, when Elizabeth looked at him and decided, with the pragmatic directness of a structural engineer who has taken enough measurements, that it was time. She told him everything. Emmanuel, 3 years. The cafe on Victoria Island, the gray shirt, space to grow. The pregnancy she'd discovered 3 weeks later. The one-way flight her mother had booked with the speed and conviction of a woman who trusted God and acted like it. She told him without performance. No tears manufactured for effect, no pausing at the dramatic moments to check his face. She simply gave him the structure of it, the load, the fracture, the collapse, and the rebuild, and let him hold it. Jungi listened without interrupting, not once. He sat with his hands wrapped around his mug and his eyes on her face and received every word the way he received everything, completely, without flinching, as though she were a bridge report he had specifically requested and was giving his full professional attention. When she finished, the apartment was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He doesn't know?" "No. Are you going to tell him?" Elizabeth considered. "I don't know yet." Jungi nodded, filed it. Asked nothing further on the subject because he understood, without being told, that this was her structure to assess and her decision to engineer. Then he said quietly, "The child is fortunate." "Why?" "Because the mother," he said, with the same even delivery he used for everything, "builds things that last." Elizabeth looked at him across the table in the Yongsan-gu apartment with the Seoul skyline behind him and felt the shift again. Deeper this time, less ambiguous, more structural. The kind of shift that means the foundation has not cracked. The kind that means something new is being built on ground that has been properly prepared. "Junji," she said, "yes. What are we doing?" He looked at her for a moment with that stillness of his, that particular, unperformed certainty, and said, "I know what I'm doing. I'm waiting for you to be ready. Now." Before we go any further, because Emmanuel is still in Lagos attending parties and performing Success and Believing, with the magnificent confidence of a man who has never been genuinely consequences ed, that life has gone exactly according to plan. Ask yourself this. Have you ever let something extraordinary walk out of your life because you were too busy performing to notice what you actually had? Drop your answer in the comments, because Emmanuel is about to find out exactly what that costs. And trust me, the bill has interest. If you're not subscribed yet, do it now. The kind of person who throws away Elizabeth Adeyemi and feels nothing about it? That energy should not be allowed to roam freely without consequence, and consequences are coming. Don't miss them. They were married in late autumn. 30 people. A small venue in Songbuk-dong with paper screens and low light, and a garden that had gone gold and rust with the season. Elizabeth's mother flew in from Lagos wearing the most extraordinary headgear anyone in Seoul had seen, which she had clearly chosen with the energy of a woman who understood she was representing an entire continent. Jungi's mother sat in the second row and cried from the moment Elizabeth appeared, which Elizabeth found so unexpectedly moving that she had to take a slow breath to keep her own composure. Jungi stood at the front in a dark suit. Of course, a dark suit. The man owned nothing else, and this one fit him with the quiet perfection of something that had been made specifically for this moment, and watched Elizabeth walk toward him with an expression that was not performed happiness but something more precise, something that looked to the 30 assembled people like a man who has been waiting for something he was not entirely sure would arrive and is now watching it come through the door. Elizabeth wore ivory. She looked extraordinary. She thought, walking toward him, not of Emmanuel. Not of Victoria Island or gray shirts or decorative fountains with nowhere to go. She thought of herself 5 months earlier, standing at a Mapogu window with both hands around a mug of tea, watching the Han River do its patient, indifferent work, wondering if she would ever feel like herself again. She felt in this moment so entirely like herself that it almost frightened her. Jungi took her hand when she reached him. His grip was steady. Of course it was. "Ready?" he said quietly, so only she could hear. Elizabeth looked at him, this still, certain, quietly extraordinary man who had noticed her laugh across a dinner table and decided, without drama or performance, that he was interested in everything she was, and felt her child move, a slow roll of acknowledgement, as though even this small person understood the significance of the moment. "I've been ready," she said. Back in Lagos, Emmanuel Osei received a business invitation to a rooftop gala in Gangnam, Seoul. Exclusive, elegant, the kind of evening that presents itself as an opportunity and occasionally, for the wrong people, becomes something else entirely. He dressed carefully. He told his assistant to book the flight. He had absolutely no idea. Emmanuel Osei had never been the kind of man who prepared for consequences. This was not stupidity. Emmanuel was, by most measurable standards, intelligent, sharp in business, quick in conversation, socially fluent in the way that certain people are socially fluent, which is to say he understood how rooms worked and how to position himself favorably inside them. He had built a distribution company from a mid-size operation into something that turned heads at industry events. He wore success the way he wore everything else, deliberately, visibly, with full awareness of its effect. No. Emmanuel's problem was not intelligence. His problem was the specific blindness that grows in men who have never genuinely been held accountable for anything. The blindness that mistakes the absence of consequences for the absence of record. That assumes the people you've moved past have also moved on. That believes the world, like a well-trained audience, resets between performances. He landed in Seoul on a Thursday morning in early spring. The city received him the way Seoul receives everyone, without ceremony, without particular interest, with the brisk efficiency of a place that has seen everything and is mildly impressed by nothing. He checked into a hotel in Gangnam that was exactly the kind of hotel Emmanuel chose. Visible, expensive, the sort of address you mention in conversation. He ordered room service, reviewed the gala's guest list, which was curated and partial, as these things always are, and spent 40 minutes selecting the suit he would wear that evening. Black, fitted. He confirmed in the mirror, excellent. He arrived at the rooftop venue at precisely the right time. Not first, which suggests desperation, and not late, which suggests either arrogance or poor logistics. The venue was everything the invitation had promised. The Gangnam skyline arranged behind it like a backdrop designed by someone with a generous budget and a good eye, soft lighting that made everyone look like the best version of themselves, the quiet percussion of expensive glasses and careful conversations. Emmanuel moved through it with the ease of a man in his natural habitat. He collected 2 business cards in the first 20 minutes. Exchanged compliments about the view, found the bar, ordered something that arrived in a glass with unnecessary geometry, and turned to survey the room with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he belongs everywhere he goes. That was when he saw her. She was standing near the far railing with a small group, 2 Korean businessmen, a woman Emmanuel didn't recognize, and a man in a dark suit whose back was currently turned. She was laughing at something someone had said, the laugh arriving unguarded and complete, the kind that doesn't ask the room for permission. She was wearing a deep green dress that managed to be elegant without trying. Her hair was up. She was holding a glass of water. She was unmistakably Elizabeth Adeyemi. Emmanuel went very still. His brain, to its credit, performed the calculation quickly. Different city, 8 months, significant life events, this is unexpected. But the result the calculation produced was not caution. It was not the quiet, adult recognition that perhaps he should leave well enough alone, that the woman across the rooftop had moved to a different country and built a different life, and clearly had no need for his presence in it. The result was, God help him, ego. She looked good. She looked, if he was being precise, extraordinary, calm and settled and entirely herself in a way that he had never quite seen when she was with him, which should have told him something important, and instead only told him that he had apparently underestimated her, which his brain immediately converted into a desire to reintroduce himself to something he had voluntarily discarded. This is the particular pathology of certain men. They do not want what they have. They want what they had the moment someone else wants it too. He straightened his jacket, began to move toward her. He was halfway across the rooftop when the man in the dark suit turned around. Emmanuel didn't know Jungi Choi's face, but he knew, with the instinct of a man who had spent years reading rooms, that the face he was now looking at belonged to someone whose category of existence was different from his own. Not taller, not louder, not more dramatically present. Simply different, the way a load-bearing wall is different from a decorative partition. Both vertical, not remotely the same. Jungi's eyes found Emmanuel before Emmanuel had decided what to do with himself. He did not react. His expression did not change. He simply noted Emmanuel's approach the way a building notes weather. registering it, accounting for it, entirely untroubled by it. Elizabeth turned then, following Jungi's gaze, and saw Emmanuel. To her credit, and there was significant credit available, her face did not collapse into any of the things Emmanuel might have expected. No embarrassment, no residual softness, not even the theatrical coldness of someone who has been rehearsing this moment. She looked at him with the calm, measured expression of a structural engineer who has just identified a minor irregularity in an otherwise resolved report. Noted, not concerning. Moving on. Emmanuel, she said, simply. His name as a complete sentence, neither warm nor sharp. Elizabeth. He arrived at the group with his best smile assembled. I didn't expect. No, she agreed pleasantly. You wouldn't. The two Korean businessmen exchanged a glance with the subtlety of men who had not survived their respective industries by missing subtext. The woman Elizabeth had been speaking with suddenly found her phone extremely interesting. Jungi said nothing. He stood beside Elizabeth with one hand resting at the small of her back, not possessive, not performative, simply present, the way a well-placed column is present in a structure that doesn't need it to announce itself, and watched Emmanuel with the patient, unreadable attention of a man who has already read the full report and is now simply watching the building confirm his assessment. Emmanuel looked at Junji. Junji looked at Emmanuel. Junji Choi, Elizabeth said with the particular ease of a woman performing an introduction she finds mildly entertaining. My husband. Emmanuel's smile did not fall. He was too practiced for that. But something behind it shifted, a hairline fracture, invisible to most, loud to anyone who knew where to look. Husband, Emmanuel repeated. Elizabeth confirmed in the tone of someone confirming a structural specification they find entirely uninteresting. Jungi extended his hand. His grip, Emmanuel would later remember, was not aggressive. It was not the grip of a man making a point. It was simply the grip of a man who has never needed to make points with his hands because his hands are not the most consequential thing about him. I've heard your name, Junji said. 3 words, even, unhurried. Emmanuel, who prided himself on reading rooms, could not determine whether this was a pleasantry or a warning. It was, of course, both. The conversation that followed lasted 4 minutes. Emmanuel, operating on the peculiar autopilot of a man whose ego has taken a significant hit and is now overcompensating in real time, said several things he considered charming, and one thing he did not intend to say aloud, which was, You look different. Better, actually. Soul must agree with you. Elizabeth looked at him with the expression of a woman who has just heard something that would have devastated her 8 months ago and now lands with all the impact of a mild weather forecast. It does, she said simply. We should catch up sometime, Emmanuel said, because Emmanuel even now could not stop performing, for old times. The silence that followed was brief, comfortable on Elizabeth's side, and significantly less comfortable on Emmanuel's. Jungi spoke into it. My wife, he said quietly, doesn't keep things that no longer serve the structure. He was looking at Emmanuel when he said it. Emmanuel laughed, the laugh of a man who isn't sure if he's been insulted and doesn't want to confirm it by reacting. Right, of course. Well, enjoy the evening, Elizabeth said, with the finality of a door being closed by someone who has already moved into a different room. Emmanuel found himself somehow walking away. He wasn't sure exactly when the decision had been made or who had made it. That was the thing about Jungi Choi. You didn't notice the architecture until you were already outside of it. Emmanuel reached the bar, ordered something stronger than his previous drink, and stood with his back to the railing and his face to the room and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific and unfamiliar sensation of being entirely without leverage. Across the rooftop, Elizabeth said something quietly to Junji. He bent his head to hear it. Whatever she said made the corner of his mouth move, the closest he came in public to a smile. He straightened, looked once, briefly, in Emmanuel's direction, then returned his attention to his wife, as though Emmanuel had already ceased to be a variable worth accounting for, which, as it turned out, was the most terrifying thing he had ever done. The morning after the gala, Emmanuel woke up in his Gangnam hotel room with the particular unease of a man whose brain had been working overnight without his permission. He lay on his back staring at a ceiling that cost more per night than most people's weekly grocery budget and ran the previous evening through his mind with the methodical discomfort of someone reviewing security footage of themselves doing something embarrassing. The interaction had been fine, perfectly civil. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, no moment that an outside observer could have pointed to and said there, that was the problem. And yet, he felt, with a certainty he couldn't entirely source, that something had happened to him last night that he did not yet have the vocabulary to describe. Something had shifted in the architecture of his life while he was standing on that rooftop in his excellent suit, and he had not noticed it happening, and that, the not noticing, was the part that kept snagging. He ordered coffee, sat at the window, looked at Gangnam doing its bright, indifferent morning routine below him. Jungi Choi. He pulled out his phone and typed the name. The search results arrived with the quiet efficiency of information that has been organized by people who understand discretion. There was not an abundance of material, no splashy profiles, no magazine features, no social media presence of any kind. What existed was sparse, carefully curated, and somehow more authoritative for its sparseness. A mention in a Korean financial journal, a name attached to 3 separate infrastructure investment firms. A single photograph from a charity event 4 years ago, dark suit, of course, standing slightly apart from the group in the way that men who don't need to be photographed stand when someone insists on taking a photograph. Emmanuel scrolled. He found a reference in an English-language Seoul business publication, a brief, carefully worded paragraph in an article about consolidated interests in the port logistics sector that described Jungi Choi as a private individual with significant influence across multiple industries, known for his long memory and his preference for resolving matters quietly. Long memory. Resolving matters quietly. Emmanuel read that sentence twice. He put his phone face down on the table and drank his coffee, looking out at Gangnam, and told himself, with the determined optimism of a man who has not yet accepted that the game has already changed, that he was reading too much into things. It had been a gala. He had said hello to his ex-girlfriend who was fine, apparently now married to a man with a long memory and a preference for quiet resolutions. But that was simply life. People moved on. It was entirely fine. He was completely fine. His phone rang. It was Kwame, his operations manager back in Lagos. Kwame called every morning at 9 without exception, which was one of the reasons Emmanuel had hired him and one of the reasons Emmanuel occasionally found him exhausting. Good morning. How's Seoul? Fine. Good. What's the update on the Abuja contract? A pause. Kwame was not a man who paused without reason. There's been a development. Femi called last night. The consortium has decided to restructure their vendor selection. They're reviewing all current applications. Emmanuel frowned. We submitted 6 weeks ago. We're already in final consideration. I know. Femi says it's a procedural review. He didn't sound like himself, honestly. A bit careful. Careful how? Like someone who'd been spoken to. Emmanuel was quiet for a moment. Outside, Seoul moved with its usual frictionless efficiency, entirely unbothered. I'll call him, Emmanuel said. I tried this morning. He didn't pick up. Emmanuel ended the call and sat with the coffee going cold in his hand and the Gangnam skyline looking back at him with no particular sympathy. The Abuja contract was significant, not the largest his company had pursued, but strategically important, the kind of deal that opened doors to 3 other conversations he'd been carefully building toward for 18 months. A procedural review at this stage was unusual. Femi not picking up was unusual. Both things happening the morning after a Seoul rooftop gala was. He stopped the thought before it completed itself. He was being paranoid. He called Femi 4 times between 9 and 11. On the 4th attempt, Femi picked up with the energy of a man answering a call he had been hoping would stop coming. Emmanuel, I was going to call you. What's happening with the contract? A long pause. The kind that contains a full paragraph of information that the speaker has decided to compress into silence. It's been withdrawn from consideration. The consortium has decided to go a different direction. What direction? We were the strongest application. You told me. Emmanuel. Femi's voice was quiet, careful. The voice of a man choosing each word the way you choose your footing on uncertain ground. I think you should come home. I think you should come home and we should have a conversation in person, and I think you should be thoughtful in the coming days about how you spend your energy. The call ended. Emmanuel stared at his phone. He thought about a sentence from a financial journal, long memory, resolving matters quietly. He told himself again that he was being paranoid. He flew back to Lagos on Saturday. By Sunday, the second development had arrived. His import partner of 4 years, a man named Rotimi, who had attended Emmanuel's 35th birthday party and given a speech about loyalty and shared futures, sent a brief, formal email informing him that their arrangement was being restructured due to shifting strategic priorities and that all pending shipments were on hold pending a full contractual review. The email was polite, it was precise, it contained no anger and no explanation, and was somehow more unsettling for both absences. Emmanuel called Rotimi. Rotimi, like Femi, did not pick up. Emmanuel sat in his office, the office he had designed himself, with the view he had selected specifically, in the building whose address he mentioned in introductions, and felt the walls of his very expensive life develop a faint, almost imperceptible vibration. He called a friend in the investment sector. The friend was available, chatty, warm, and mentioned, with the studied casualness of someone delivering information they'd been asked to deliver naturally, that there was some talk in certain circles about Emmanuel's company. Nothing specific, just talk. The kind that made people cautious, the kind that arrived without a source anyone could specifically identify and spread with the efficiency of something that had been deliberately seeded. Emmanuel ended the call. He thought about a rooftop in Gangnam, a dark suit. A handshake that was not aggressive, not pointed, simply present. I've heard your name. 3 words, even, unhurried. He thought about Elizabeth, not the Elizabeth of last Thursday. Calm, green dress, water glass, the devastating pleasantness of a woman who has genuinely moved on. He thought about the Elizabeth of 3 years. The one who had traveled 4 hours to sit beside him. The one who had left exact change for her coffee and walked out with her dignity intact. The one he had described, to a friend over drinks, as someone he'd left because he needed room to evolve. Room to evolve. He was evolving now, certainly, at speed, in a direction he had not selected. On Monday, his accountant called with a question about a financial compliance review that had been opened, apparently, by a regulatory body that had never previously expressed any interest in his company's operations. On Tuesday, always a Tuesday, this universe had a sense of humor. His largest domestic client sent a letter, formal and brief, indicating they were exploring alternative partnerships, effective immediately. Emmanuel sat very still in his office. He was not stupid. He had established that. He was sharp, socially fluent, professionally accomplished, and possessed of the particular intelligence that had built something real from relative nothing. And he understood, now, with the cold, clear comprehension of a man watching an avalanche from directly below it, what was happening to him. No one had threatened him. No one had shouted or confronted or sent a message with any identifiable signature. There had been no dramatic moment he could point to, no villain's monologue, no meeting in a dark room, just doors closing, quietly, one after another. With the unhurried, methodical efficiency of someone who had planned this the way a structural engineer plans a controlled demolition, identifying every load-bearing point, every support, every connection that kept the building standing, and removing them in precisely the right sequence so that when the structure finally came down, it came down completely, and it came down on itself. Emmanuel opened his laptop, searched the name again. Jun-gi Choi, long memory, resolving matters quietly. He closed the laptop, sat in his expensive office in his expensive building with his expensive view, and understood for the first time what Elizabeth Adeyemi had known since February. Some people don't need to raise their voice, because their silence is already doing everything necessary. There is a specific kind of quiet that follows a controlled demolition, not silence. Silence is the absence of sound, and this was not that. This was something more deliberate. The quiet of a city that has watched something come down and returned, without ceremony, to its regular business. The quiet of a matter that has been resolved by people who resolve matters without needing to discuss having resolved them. Emmanuel Osei sat in the rubble of his professional life and learned, at considerable personal expense, a lesson that should have been available to him for free. By the 3rd week after Seoul, the inventory was thorough and unambiguous. The Abuja contract, gone. Rotimi's import partnership, suspended indefinitely, which is the business vocabulary for permanently. We simply haven't said so formally yet. The domestic client who had sent the polite letter of departure, gone. 2 additional business conversations that had been moving toward conclusion had gone strangely, inexplicably quiet, the way conversations go quiet when the other party has been told something they are not going to repeat to you. His accountant was still working through the compliance review, which was not illegal, not targeted at anything specific, simply present. A bureaucratic fog that required time, money, and attention, and produced nothing except the sustained anxiety of a man who now had to explain his finances to people he had never previously needed to explain anything to. Emmanuel had, in the space of 3 weeks, gone from a man attending exclusive galas in Gangnam to a man spending his mornings on hold with regulatory offices and his evenings staring at spreadsheets that no longer told the story he had written for himself. He told no one. This was the final vanity, the insistence on performing fine while everything quietly wasn't. He went to his club. He attended a friend's event. He laughed at the right moments and ordered the right things and presented to every room he entered the surface of a man whose life was proceeding according to plan. Beneath the surface, he was doing the one thing he had never previously found necessary. He was thinking about Elizabeth Adeyemi, not with desire. That particular self-delusion had been cleanly resolved on a Gangnam rooftop by the sight of a woman in a green dress who looked at him with the mild, untroubled interest of someone identifying a minor footnote. He was thinking about her the way you think about a building you once stood inside and didn't appreciate, with the belated, expensive understanding of what it had actually been holding up. He thought about the 4-hour drive she had made to sit beside him during the contract crisis that was his own fault. He thought about the Sunday cooking, and the rescheduled meetings, and the explanations she had quietly swallowed, and the exact change she had left for her coffee, just her coffee, not his, before walking out with her dignity so completely intact that he had mistaken it, catastrophically, for indifference. He thought about what she had built in the months since: a city, a career, a language, a life so solid and so genuinely hers that when he had appeared on that rooftop, in his excellent suit, with his assembled smile and his strategic positioning, she had looked at him with not even the satisfaction of someone watching an apology arrive, just the calm of someone who no longer needed one. She had not done this to him. He understood that now, with the precision of a man who has had 3 weeks of enforced stillness in which to be honest with himself. Jungi Choi had done this to him. But Elizabeth had simply lived her life so well, so completely, so without reference to Emmanuel's opinion of it, that her life itself had become the consequence. She had not asked Jungi to do anything. She had not needed to. She had simply been, so entirely and so visibly, someone worth protecting, and a man with a long memory and a preference for quiet resolutions had looked at what Emmanuel had discarded and understood its value immediately. The woman he underestimated wasn't standing alone. Emmanuel wrote her a message on a Wednesday afternoon in April. He sat with his phone for a long time before writing it. He drafted 3 versions. One that was too defensive, one that explained too much, one that was performing remorse for an audience that wasn't present. He deleted all 3. Then he wrote the 4th one, which was the honest one, the short one, the one that didn't ask for anything because he had finally understood that he had no standing to ask. Elizabeth, I've been doing a lot of thinking. I handled things badly. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I understand that now. I hope you're well. It looks like you are. He sent it before he could perform it into something worse. He did not expect a reply. He did not receive one immediately. What he received 3 days later was a message from Kwame informing him that the compliance review had been closed. Quietly, without resolution or finding, simply closed, the file apparently having been determined to contain nothing of regulatory interest. Rotimi's office called to say the contractual review was complete and shipments could resume at Emmanuel's discretion. No explanation was offered for either development. None was necessary. Emmanuel understood the vocabulary. This is what mercy looks like from people who do not need to offer it. The message from Elizabeth arrived on a Friday morning. He was sitting at his desk, the same view, the building still standing, though he understood its foundations differently now, and his phone lit up with her name. I know. 2 words. No punctuation at the end. No warmth manufactured for comfort. No door reopened and no door slammed. Just the clean, final acknowledgement of a woman who had heard what he said, had chosen to respond, and had said the precise amount necessary. I know. Emmanuel sat with those 2 words for a long time. They were, he would eventually understand, a gift. Not the gift of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a door, and this was not an invitation. It was the gift of being seen clearly by someone who had earned the right to see him clearly, and had chosen, in seeing him, not to diminish him further, but simply to confirm that she had always known the truth, had always known her own worth, and had never, not for a single moment of any ordinary Tuesday, needed his recognition of it to make it real. In the Yongsan-gu apartment, on a Friday morning in April, Elizabeth Adeyemi, Elizabeth Choi, now in the official documentation, and in the way Jungi's mother said her name at Sunday dinners with the particular warmth of a woman welcoming something she had been hoping for, sat in the good chair by the window with her daughter in her arms, 6 weeks old. Adeyes had been first to hold her, and had cried with the uninhibited generosity of a woman who had earned the right, having met Elizabeth at an airport with a handwritten sign and fed her sweet potatoes and sat on warm floors in matching cotton shorts and watched, with the patience of genuine love, her best friend find her way back to herself. Jungi's mother had named her, in the Korean tradition, the name a gift from the grandparent, Seoyeon, meaning auspicious, beautiful, softly spoken. Elizabeth had added a second name privately, in the Yoruba tradition her mother had insisted upon, Itunu, meaning comfort, the peace that comes after. Shoyon Itunu Koi. She slept in Elizabeth's arms with the absolute democratic confidence of a person who has never had reason to doubt that she is exactly where she belongs. Junji came in from the kitchen with tea, No sugar, of course. He had not forgotten in 8 months and was not going to start now, and set it on the table beside her without interrupting the quiet. He sat on the arm of the chair and looked at his daughter with the expression Elizabeth had first seen at a dinner table in Itaewon. That particular, unperformed certainty, directed now at this small, sleeping, entirely new person with the same completeness with which he directed it at everything he had decided mattered. He placed one hand carefully against the baby's back. "She's going to be difficult," he said quietly. "Hmm? She already looks like she has opinions." Elizabeth looked down at her daughter, 6 weeks old, eyes closed, expression carrying the serene authority of someone who has, in fact, already formed several strong opinions and is simply waiting until she has the vocabulary to express them, and laughed. The real laugh. The unguarded one. The one that didn't ask the room for permission and had, 8 months ago in an Itaewon apartment, made a still and certain man decide he was interested in everything she was. "She gets that from her mother," Junji said. "Is that a complaint?" "It's an observation," he said, which was what he always said, and Elizabeth shook her head and looked back at her daughter and felt, not the relief of survival, not the vindication of outcome, not the satisfaction of a story concluded, but something quieter and more permanent than any of those things. She felt like a building that has been properly built, load-bearing walls in the right places, foundation prepared with care, designed not for the skyline but for the ground, constructed by someone who understood that the most important quality in any structure is not how it looks from the outside. It is what it can hold, it is what it protects, it is what, when everything around it shifts and settles, remains. Emmanuel Osai, in Lagos, on a Friday morning in April, placed his phone face down on his desk and went back to work. He was rebuilding, slowly. Without the performance he had previously considered essential. He was learning, at the age of 38, which is late, but not, if you are honest with yourself and lucky, too late, the difference between the version of success you construct for audiences and the kind you build for foundations. He was learning what Elizabeth Adeyemi had always known, that the structures worth having are not the ones that look impressive from the street. They are the ones that stand when everything else comes down. This was never a story about revenge. It was a story about what happens when a woman stops watering other people's gardens and finally tends to her own, and what grows there, what always, quietly, was going to grow there. If you believe that every woman who walks away with her dignity intact is already walking towards something extraordinary, subscribe. Like this. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. The people who throw away their Elizabeth, they always find out. They just never see it coming until the doors are already closed.